I'm really based in a school of philosophy and religious studies, so I do comparative religious ethics and I do environmental philosophy. But I'm not sure, I think you may have ruined me for philosophy conferences for the rest of my life. We've got Alfred North Whitehead today, we've got care ethics, we've got all kinds of great political philosophy, so I'm really enjoying myself. I'm going to try to stick to what I'd imagined originally, and we'll graft it all in the discussion. So I think I need to start off with some we need to start off with a bit of ecology. Now, ordinarily, it would often be that we'd turn to climate change to try to frame why we've got a big problem with the world. I thought I'd pivot a little bit, particularly because I'm working on a project right now, which is an HRC-funded religion and extinction project. We're trying to kind of surface the ways that we construct extinction. And so that's been on my mind. And so I thought I'd just open us up by thinking a little bit about the extinction crisis, which, to put it briskly, is that we're looking at roughly 40 to 80% of the species on Earth becoming extinct in the next century or so. So this is being called the sixth great extinction, sort of mirrored after those other great events which were caused by meteors or massive climatic changes. This one happens to be different, of course, because it's anthropogenic. That is, it's being caused by us. Now, on one hand, this is being driven by changes in land use. A lot of that's for farming, where forest is being cleared to do things like making palm oil, which is in your peanut butter, and just about everything else. But it's not just that. It's also driven by lots of other different kinds of change in land use. But the main thing that's driving the extinction crisis is the way that we're changing land. And so to my mind, this is very much a design problem. Now, some of my colleagues today, particularly Mahmoud and Stephanie, have already raised this issue of design being about not just providing solutions, but also having problems. And so I want to open up today by kind of framing things out in that way, just to say that the extinction crisis isn't something that sort of happens to us by accident. It's come out of some particular design legacies. And this is one of the things that I unpack in a little bit greater length in the book chapter. I'm not going to go into all the detail because you can read that there. But I want to particularly talk about some of the ways in which we design cities as places for people, beautiful places for people quite often, but potentially places that are designed for the eradication of other forms of life, hygienic spaces. And that idea of design as the creation of hygienic space is, of course, something which is very much firmly rooted in the legacy of modern design. That was a problem with racial hygiene, and I think that's been sort of foregrounded quite a lot, the ways in which whiteness was very much in the middle of 20th century design. But it was also about destroying other than human kinds of life. So I want to just really emphasize at the beginning that we're not talking about something that happened to us by accident. We're happening to a problem in some ways that we designed ourselves into. And so I think it's going to require us to really think quite carefully about our underpinning ideologies and some of the frameworks that we're working with and the ways in which those feed into these narratives of eradication and hygiene. In summary, what I want to say is that we've got this problem with things which crawl and are slimy, things which breed and buzz, things which are unfamiliar to us. So there's an aesthetic valence to this. It's about maybe the cultivation of disgust, even. So we're not talking about something that's an accident. We're talking about something which is designed. And so I want to suggest a couple of paradigms. And I'm working fast and loose shuttling between philosophy and design, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. But I want to suggest a couple of particular ways of approaching environmental design, or ecological design, as I prefer to call it. And the first thing that I'd like to recommend is something which I call reconciliation ecology. So if we're going to think about a design response to the extinction crisis, the first thing that we're going to have to really get our heads around is how to share space with things like that. Because I think one thing that urban design and environmental design has gotten quite good at is bringing in things which are bright green and have flowers, or things which are furry, which you can pet and appreciate, or maybe they might bite your hand off, but you can at least appreciate they've got 4 legs and a tail, and they kind of fit within our patterns, right? But what do we do about all the other things? And if we look back at this chart, that's where a lot of the problems are. We're talking about dragonflies and ferns and reptiles and amphibians. And particularly amphibians is one of the places where extinction is potentially the most acute. So we're talking about losing a whole lot of frogs. And they might seem cute from a distance, but if we had, a sort of frog infestation climbing along the stairs over here, I mean, how do you think we would respond to that particular thing? Okay, so I think fundamentally what we're looking at is a need to think about reconciling ourselves to these kinds of creatures. What would design look like, particularly in the built environment, if we were to think about integrating those things? And I was thinking about this just the other day as I was visiting someone's house, and it's a house in the country in Idaho. It's a family member of mine. And I was washing dishes up, we just finished lunch, and I noticed there were a bunch of ants crawling around on the surface of their counter. And I thought, oh, that's upsetting. We need to sort of get those out of here. And then they just finished building the house. So I thought, well, what's wrong with the build? And this was just, sort of coming to my own mind, and I'm writing about this stuff, but the reflexes are still there. And I just sort of paused and thought, where is that coming from, that impulse? And that even got me thinking, there's a porous building envelope here, and I'm instinctively thinking of that as a problem. But in some ways, that's a solution, actually. But it's a very foreign solution. I don't think it's one that we design towards particularly often. So I want to recommend that that's the kind of thing that we need to think our way into if we're going to start to think about new ecologies. And now it seems strange for me to call this a new ecology if it's got things which are obviously creatures in it. But I do think the way that we construct ecological and green quite often in the space of design is rather limited in terms of the cast of creatures. Now, I think we're all kind of on board here, generally, in terms of wanting to make our design more sustainable. I'm going to assume that's sort of given. So, I think we're already halfway in the right direction. So what I want to just foreground is the fact that there's a slightly bigger challenge, which we might not anticipate when we're thinking about these kinds of things. And this relates to thinking back towards reconciliation, and the reason that I'm hammering on this so much is that there's a kind of follow-on problem with the extinction crisis, which is that we may not ever actually have less things with legs walking around. What we might end up with is less variety in those things. And this is what some critical theorists are calling the homogocene, which is, of course, a play on the Anthropocene. So reckoning with our alterity in terms of the way that we think about ecology and the forms of life that we want to have near us is going to be a very big problem. So I think as we face the homogocene, or we try to design around the homogocene, I'm not sure I have solutions, but I do want to ask the question, what are we doing in design practice to welcome in those kinds of creatures, to create porous spaces within our own personal envelopes? This is why I've been having us sit with this slightly uncomfortably massive ants on the screen for so long. Sorry about that. So here's a great example of course, the kind of design expression of this. This happened in Bristol not too long ago, actually. Now, there's a bunch of fancy cars underneath that tree. Of course, no one wants bird crap on their BMW, so what do? Well, we've got spikes on all of our high-rises, right? So buy some spikes and put them on a tree, which seems just ridiculous. But then if you think of the more moderate versions of that, would we think they're ridiculous? Keeping birds off of buildings? It's the same kind of problem, right? So what I want to briefly and aspirationally propose in the next minute and a half or so are four maybe points of emphases in terms of thinking our way into a kind of reconciliation ecology. The first thing I want to emphasize is that we're going to need to do deep history. And this came up with me when I was talking to an urban planner in Birmingham just a couple of weeks ago. We were thinking about, they're redesigning a green space in the middle of the city in a deprived area, and we were talking about what it would look like to really do that green space well. And we got to talking about deep history, because of course, the city has been built around, and the green space has been done and redone, and we don't actually know what forms of life would want to inhabit that space if we really just let it go. What's natural, to use that very problematic term? So we need to think about doing deep history in the way that we think about the built environment, the way we think about human habitation. We need to try to reconstruct, possibly. We need to also, I think, cultivate deep sympathy. This is a little bit more obvious. We need to think about getting past the things that have charisma, that appeals to us, and try to reconcile ourselves to the things that make us uncomfortable, find their beauty. Or maybe not even find it in beauty at all. I think we're going to need to cultivate deep love. And here I want to say that we need to find ways to combat the forms of hatred which are woven into design paradigms, like those spikes on that tree, but not just there. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that what I'm proposing here is kind of anarchistic. Or maybe we could say it's a radically democratic way of thinking about welcome and self-relinquishment. And so I think many people, we just need to acknowledge, are going to find this terribly challenging. And I think it's pretty reasonable for them to find it challenging. So what we're going to need is some form of deep patience as we sink into that.